Hello fellow cavers, Peter Jones here. I am here unfortunately behind or in front of my camera here creating this video which is supposed to take place of my actually being at convention this year, and as we all know it's kind of a sad event that we can't get together any closer than doing this over the internet more or less. So I hope that you're all enjoying this one way or another. This, I think, is a good sort of alternative way to enjoy being cavers. Just a little bit about myself. I am a member of the NSS for over 50 years now. I started caving in 1968 in Colorado when I was at the University of Denver, and I joined the NSS about 1 year later. And I've been caving mostly in the Guadalupe Mountains now for about 51 years. I also am a cave photographer. You may have seen some of my work in different salons and so on and so forth. But I will say that my career basically is that I've been a potter, a full-time potter now for 47 years, and actually throwing pots for 49 years. And just a brief little bit of history. I kind of knew at the age of about 7 years old that I wanted to be a caver. I went to a summer camp in Washington, Maine, not too far from where I live here in Camden, Maine right now. And back in 1956, all of us in the Cub Camp took a drive up to Acadia National Park, and one of the first places that we stopped at in the park was to see what was called Anemone Sea Cave. Now, sea cave, of course, is very different from limestone caves, but I remember going into it and just being fascinated by the idea of what a cave could potentially look like. I'd seen photographs of caves, but I'd never been in any real caves myself. So being in that sea cave when I was 7 years old was a great experience. Not too long after going to Acadia National Park, we went to I can't even remember the name of it, Fort Knox in Bucksport, Maine. Not the one where the gold is, but the one in Maine. And I remember that one of my counselors told us that there was a passage that went underneath the Penobscot River, which is about 300 feet wide, and that it came out on the other side on Verona Island. Well, that's all it took for me to go looking everywhere in this granite fortress, trying to find the secret passageway that would take me into that passage underneath the river. Well, I don't think that the passage actually exists. I think that was just something that our counselors told us about to get us excited about it. But that was really the time when I said, I want to be a caver at some point in time. Well, about 4 years later, the movie Journey to the Center of the Earth came out, and I was totally infatuated by it. I found that about 13 minutes of that film was actually photographed in Carlsbad Caverns National Park. Little did I realize that many, many years later I would actually be photographing for the Park Service. It's, you know, in many of the same places that that movie was filmed. So that's sort of my history. I also was introduced to pottery in the summer of 1961 out in California. We drove out to California to spend the summer out there at my grandparents' place, and a couple of blocks down the road there was a place called the Pottery Shack. And I went down there one time, and this woman came out and gave a demonstration of throwing pots on a potter's wheel, much like what I have here. And I watched that woman throw pots, and I thought I was looking at magic. It was just astounding to me, and I thought, I have got to do that. So both my caving interests and my pottery interests started at a very young age, and I've been able to follow through on that to this day. And I am still very happy to be a caver and very happy to be a potter. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to start, because I was going to be giving some pottery demonstrations at convention this year in Elkins. Instead, I'm going to give you some demonstrations here of what and how I do, the techniques that I use to throw pots and all. And I'm also videoing this for 2 other similar virtual events like our convention is this year. So I'm not going to talk too much more about the caving part of it because other people are going to be listening who probably don't really care that much about my being a caver. So, here we go. I have been a potter for a long, long time. I absolutely love doing this. I normally come out here virtually every day of the year to make pots. And I've gotten to be pretty good at it, at least I like to think I have. And I hope that you enjoy some of what I do, and I'm going to try and explain to you how I do some of the things that I throw and how I decorate them and so on and so forth. Well, the first thing is that I'm using a sort of self-made potter's wheel seating arrangement here that makes it much more comfortable for me to sit here like this. You might not be able to see from the camera that I'm actually sort of in a kneeling position, and the seat behind me is tilted like this. So my back right now is perfectly straight, and it really has cut way down on the classic potter's bad back, so to speak. So I'm pretty happy about that. So the first thing I do is normally I would be wedging this clay to sort of kind of homogenize the dryness or the wetness of the clay. Almost any time that you take clay out of a bag, it's a good idea to sort of wedge the clay. I use a device called a Pug Mill, which is a mechanical thing that does pretty much the same thing, and it just extrudes out the clay. So I'm not going to do the wedging here and now, but just take my word for it that wedging the clay is very important. So I try and get it on the center of the wheel as best as possible. I have a sponge here that I hold in my hand almost entirely. I keep it really wet to begin with. And the first thing I want to do is push down on the clay, put a lot of weight with my left hand down on it to really make sure that it's attached to the wheel. Then I'm going to squeeze in, sort of using the heels of my hand here to lift and raise up the clay. And what this is doing is, as I do that, it's kind of pushing any air bubbles that might still be there in the clay into the middle. And I'm going to push it back down again. And then I'm going to lift it up again the same way. This takes a little bit of strength to do this. And I mean, I've gotten so used to doing this all the time that I can't quite explain exactly what I'm doing. But basically, I'm using all of my muscles here. You know, my forearm, my biceps, my chest muscles, and so on and so forth, to really kind of squeeze on that clay and push it up, and then push it back down again. So this way, any air bubbles that might be in there have been pretty much pushed into the center of the clay. You'll also notice that when I take away my hands, I'm taking them away very, very slowly, because if you're pushing on the clay and you suddenly take your hands away like that, you can see that it goes out of round. So what you need to do is get it centered and then very slowly remove your hands so that it remains centered. Then I sometimes get rid of a little bit of the clay right around the bottom here on the wheel, because if my hands keep going over a bump of clay in the wheel, it can really affect what I'm doing here. So I'm going to start off by throwing a couple of mugs here. I've put there's enough clay there for probably 2 good-sized mugs. So this is sort of like a smaller version of doing what's called throwing off the hump. So what I'm going to do, in order to make a coffee mug, I don't need a whole lot of clay, so I'm just going to sort of pull up a little bit of the clay from the bottom here. I even have enough space for 3 different mugs to be thrown. So I've sort of got this started here, and then the next step is going to be, I'm going to push very lightly with my thumb right in the middle here to start drilling into the lump of clay. Now I could feel that there were some little bubbles, air bubbles in there right now. So I'm going to continue to push down. Now I'm going to switch over to using my fingers this way. I'm going to continue to push down. I don't want to go too deep because you know, I don't want the mug to be really tall and deep and so on and so forth. So I'm just going to now start to pull out. Now you'll notice that I'm putting the heel of my hand here on the outside, and I'm going to kind of lock it into with my elbow here, so that when I start pushing on the inside, I'm pushing against the palm of my hand here. and that sort of begins to thin out the clay a little bit. It's probably about 1.5 inches wide on the inside here. I'm going to soak up some of the excess water that's down there, and the reason that I do that is that if you let the water sit in there too long, the clay will absorb some of that water. It will expand the clay out more than the rest of it, and then when it's finally drying out, because there's so much more water originally in the bottom, that means that it's going to shrink even more, and that sometimes causes cracks in the bottoms of pots, and we don't want those to happen. Those are called drying cracks. So now that I've got the basic size of it and width of it, now I'm going to go back in with my fingers, and again you'll notice that I'm pushing against the heel of my hand here, and I'm going to start pulling the walls of the pot up like this. Now you'll see that it is spreading out. Now I don't really want it to spread out all of that much, but sometimes that's just simply what happens. So I'm going to put just a little bit of water on the inside here, and then I'm going to sort of compress the clay on the top, bring it back in, and you can see it's a little bit lumpy here, so now I'm going to push down on the top a little bit to sort of get everything back into shape. Okay, so I've done the first pull. Now I'm going to do another pull over here, and this time my finger on the outside is doing the pushing and the lifting, and my finger on the inside is sort of, something to push against. Now a lot of times potters are taught that what you should do is when you're lifting the clay up is that you put your finger on the outside and you push in with it, and then your other finger is supposed to be up above it, so that when you're pushing, in opposing things or in opposing locations or whatever, that's supposed to help raise the clay up. Now that's the way that most people get taught. I don't think that's the way that you should do it. My way of lifting the clay up is that instead of having them separated like this, I push a little bit, I still push from the outside here, but my finger is sort of wrapping around the clay here from the inside. And so I also join my hands together to sort of have it move as like I sort of set my fingers in terms of the pressure and everything, and then I just pull both the hands up at the same time like this. So once more I'm going to narrow down the top a little bit here. I'm going to do one final pull. And remember that this time now I'm pulling like this with this finger sort of, well, this finger is kind of bent because of a car accident that I was in anyway, so it's sort of like pre-bent for being a good potter, but my finger is just going to push against it that way. So here we go. This is going to be the last pull to actually thin out the clay. Let go very, very slowly and evenly, because I don't want it, if I let go of it too quickly like I showed you before, it was going to get all wobbly and everything. So now I've got the right height, the clay is nice and thin, and now I'm going to start getting into doing a couple of things here. Usually I use a lot of water only to do the centering of the clay, and then also to thin the clay out a little bit. And once I'm done pulling the clay up, I try and throw as dry as I can. Now that doesn't mean that it's bone dry in there, but what I'm doing, you'll notice, is I'm kind of grabbing some of the water that is still down there in the bottom. And if I use any water at all, it's usually just enough to keep the inside well lubricated. Now, I use what is called a rib here. This is a stainless steel rib that I use just about all the time. It has a good straight flat edge, but it also has some nice curvatures in here that can be used in different ways to help shape the shape of the pot and everything. But what I'm going to do here is I'm going to start at the top, and this is something that a lot of people don't do. A lot of people start at the bottom and then press it out. The only problem with that is that when you're pressing things out from the bottom, if you make a little bit of a mistake that starts to throw things off, everything that is above it is going to be changed. It's going to all start wobbling up above, all because of the little bit of problem that you had down there at the bottom. So instead of starting at the bottom and pulling up with the rib, I start at the top and then I push down, and it's much, much, much easier for me to keep it very stable. Now, I'm doing this for a number of reasons. One is that, again, I'm getting rid of excess clay. Okay, you'll see that I still have a lot of clay right here that has just been peeled off of there. It is now very dry on the outside, which is good. The inside of it is still somewhat damp, which is fine because I'm still going to be changing the shape of the outside of this mug here. So, got rid of that excess water, the little pool of water in the bottom. Now I'm compressing the rim a little bit, just to make sure that it's nice and rounded here. And now, because one of the things that I am going to be teaching in here is texturing and decorative techniques and everything. Now there are many, many different ways that you can put decorative impressions into clay. That's one of the wonderful things about clay and what I really love about it. So I'm going to use, clean off some of the dried clay on here first. Now this is just a very simple tool. I think it cost me maybe like $1 or $2. I don't even know what it was normally meant to be used for, but basically it's sort of like a curved point that comes out like that. There's a wide one here at the top, and then the bottom one is very similar. It's just that it's smaller in size. So I use this as a way to actually push into the side of the mug here, and I'll show you what I'm doing. And I'm just sort of run this up and down a little bit, very free-formed here. And put a little bit of water on the inside so I can press against it. So I'm just going to start at the bottom here, and I'm just going to go a couple of up and down swirls here. And you can see that they're sort of very free-formed. I didn't actually overlap too much here or anything like that, but I kind of like that shape. So now I'm going to go back and I'm going to start pressing the clay. I can't touch the outside of it anymore because, except up here at the very top. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to start pressing from the inside out to start stretching it. And you'll notice that I started at the top and went all the way down to the bottom. Now I'm going to come back up again and I'm going to expand it a little bit more. And then I'm going to again start at the top, push down, push it out, creating the shaping for it. Now remember that because I threw the clay very thin before I started to expand it, the clay is getting to be ever thinner in there. And the advantage, or the good thing about it, is that it makes the coffee mug much less heavy. A lot of times when some potters throw pots, the pot's really heavy, and even when the cup is empty, it feels like you've got an entire load of coffee in there or something like that. Most people like their coffee mugs, you want them to be strong for sure, but you expand this out a little bit more. The more I expand it, the more coffee that it can hold. Everybody likes a big cup of coffee, at least I sure do. So there we go. That's pretty much the shape that I want to have. Now I'm going to take one of these flexible ribs here, as it's called, and I'm going to use this to sort of do the final finishing shape on the upper part of the mug here. The nice thing about a mug like this is that the lip itself is quite thin. You don't feel like you're kind of having to drink coffee out of a mug that's about as thick as a watermelon, more or less, especially at the lip. So, press that in there. And last look here to see if the shape is what I want. once it's done, I use a piece of monofilament fishing line, 25 pound here, to cut my pots off. So I'm just going to hold it here and let it sort of start digging into the clay, and once it's pretty well aligned, then I'm just going to pull it right on through. And then I don't even bother stopping the pot from spinning. I just lift it right up, and there is the mug right there with that nice decorative technique. And using that one particular thing. You can use almost anything. Instead of using this sort of chevron shaped thing here that I used, you could use the corner of a rib like this. This would work just as well. You could go even deeper with that. You've got to be careful with something like that because you might actually pierce through the walls of the mug or whatever. Alright, so now I'm going to do another mug, and in this case I'm going to do a different sort of texturing thing. This is working with texturing the clay while you are throwing it. There are so many different times and places that you can actually do make different impressions in the clay, or decorate it in certain ways. There's so many things, and that's one of the many things that I'm going to be talking about here. So I'm going to do a different style. So I'm just going to make this kind of like a taller mug or whatever, just to sort of illustrate it. Again, I'm going to start pushing it down with my thumb. And once I've got it started, then I'm going to put a little bit of water in there and then finish pushing it down. Try and leave about 1/4 of an inch or so of clay down in the bottom, because you're going to lose some of that thickness when you cut it off. Even when you're using a really thin monofilament fishing line. Got to have enough down there so that it's not going to start leaking or develop a hole or something like that. So again, I'm going to push the heel of my hand here into and sort of underneath it, and then I'm going to start pulling the clay against it, and as I'm pushing it against this right here, it's beginning to thin and rise the clay up again, once it's just like I did before. Now I'm going to start pulling this up. And once again, it's sort of started to expand out a little bit, so fix the rim a little bit. Press the rim back in. Better to do it now than later on, because once you really start to expand it out, it's really hard to get those things back into shape again if you don't do it early on. So I'm going to push in a little bit more at the bottom. Again, lift my fingers sort of together. Notice how my left thumb here is holding on to my fingers over here. That shortens the distance of keeping those two things working together with one another. If you were doing like this, it's really hard to go through all of that, all of that distance in order to keep your hands sort of working at the, in the same idea or the same way. Get rid of that excess water. Just enough to thin the pots out. It does help to have a really good clay that has good plasticity to it. Now you might notice that there's a little bit of a wobble down there at the bottom, and that's because I am getting it quite thin right there, and there's a little bit of torquing as I'm trying to pull it up higher up, but it's not a problem because I'm going to tighten this up a little bit more. And again, because I am going to be using this rib, and starting at the top, I can gently reshape it. There you go, all that wobble is now gone. Okay. extra water out of there. Okay, now let's try another texturing device here. This is one of my more expensive tools that I use right here. I think it cost me about 69 cents to buy this at a local hardware store. It's a piece of plastic, pretty thick and strong plastic. And I'm just trying to clean it up a little bit. It's got some dried clay on it. Basically what this is a four-sided device. It's called a notched spreader. And it is designed to, when you put like adhesive on a wall or on a floor, you use something like this as a way to sort of create rivulets in it and so on and so forth. So this has got a very sort of major saw cutting edge here, then a somewhat finer edge, and then an even thinner edge than that. And let me see if I can get this cleaned up. Got tools all over the place here. So I'm just going to use this brush here to clean out some of these things so you can get a better idea of what they look like here. So I'm going to use this very sort of small texturing in here right now. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to keep on repeating this around here. Now this is a little bit on the thin side, so it might not come out quite as well as I'd like it to. It's better if you do it when the clay is somewhat thick, but nonetheless, I'm just going to start at the bottom and do a quick pull up the side. Turn it a little bit, do another quick pull up. Again. Doesn't make that much difference if you sort of overlap things or whatever. I mean, this is just putting texture into the surface. Almost done here. Going all the way around. 2 more pulls and I'll be done. Okay, so as you can see, I've got all of these vertical lines in here right now. That's already put some texture into it. Here's another little extra thing that I sometimes do as well, is while I like those lines right there, but sometimes you can make it even a little bit more, let's say, different, so to speak. If I take the, I'm going to take the wider edge, not the really big ones, but I'm going to take the next size up, and I'm just going to sort of slowly go up, sort of swirl it around a little bit, sort of to create some different techniques or different impressions in there. Now, it doesn't look like much right now because it's just, has just recently been engraved, so to speak, with this. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to use this one side that's completely flat. It doesn't really put any texturing in there, but it's a good way to sort of create sort of a smoother upper edge area right there. I'm going to do the same down here at the bottom. Actually, that made a lot more noise than I wanted it to, but anyway, let's go back here and use the rib. And what I'm doing now with the rib is not only am I cutting away some of the excess clay at the bottom, but I'm actually compressing it a little bit too. Because it's kind of hard to throw with something that has a very, very narrow bottom to begin with. It's almost impossible because you're putting a lot of torque on the clay as you're pulling it up and going down and shaping it and so on and so forth. But once you've got the texturing in there, you can go back in, as I'm about to do again, and instead of cutting away the clay, if you turn it so that it's not gouging into the clay like this, if you turn it like that, what you're doing is you're just pressing the clay in that way, and you can make the base much more narrow and make it look lighter visually. You're not really lightening it up that much, but sometimes having a narrow base looks really better than a big fat base on the bottom. And I can still trim away any excess weight down there if need be, but that way I don't have to worry about cutting cutting a hole in it as I'm trimming the bottom. So you notice that it still is in pretty good shape. It's not wobbling around or anything like that. So what I'm going to do just before I start doing some compression from the inside is I'm just going to wet the rim a little bit, and I'm going to push it in and create an outward curve to it here. Now this is not the shape that I want it to be at the end. What this is for is to help keep the top compressed in, because if you start pushing it out, the rim will sort of want to start spreading out like that, and that's not what you want to do if you have a mug. You want to have the lip of it be kind of small. And I can always just simply turn this in right now if I wanted to. I'd just sort of like push it in like that, so you can see that it's easy to change it. But this does not keep it from coming out of being circular. This really helps quite a bit. So now what I'm going to do is start at the top. It's a little bit damp on the inside, and I'm going to start expanding the middle section here. Now, I don't want to get the inside walls here any wetter than they are right now. So what I'm going to do now is, once I've sort of started the expanding of the inside, I'm now going to switch over to using one of my ribs that I have here. Let's see, where that can go. Yep, there it is. Okay. This is, again, is one of my flexible ribs that I can use. So now I can start expanding it, but because I'm doing it dry, that means that I can really stretch it out a lot more and not have it collapse because it's too wet. So I'm going to start up at the top, push out with that rib. And you got to be careful not to push it out too far, because you can't really safely push it back in again. Because if you try and push it back in again with the rib, you're just going to destroy the texturing that's in there already. So that's why I'm very careful to do this very, very gently. You can always sort of push it out a little bit more, but you can't push it in. So I'm beginning to like the shape of this right now. I'm going to give it one more expansion here, just a little bit. Right. Okay, now the nice thing, remember that those lines that I put in here by going up, they all went up straight like this and vertically. But what happens is that as you are expanding it out, there's sort of a torquing effect in there, so that there's, those vertical lines are no longer straight up. They kind of curve around like that. And then I've got the extra, layers or impressions of the horizontal lines in there that kind of dance around. But it really changes the whole effect of it. What started off as something you're probably going, I don't think that looks all that good. It changes dramatically when you change, how it's been expanded outwards. Okay, and then finally what I'm going to do is create sort of an end point for that freeform. I'm going to use the smaller sort of end of this little device here and just push it into it very lightly, and maybe even 2 lines. And then the last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to use this chamois. Chamois is a piece of leather that comes from deer. And I'm just going to reshape the rim here. I can make it a little bit thinner if I want to. But I like the smoothing effect of sort of compressing the rim using that wet chamois. One more check at the shape, the design, etc., etc. Alright. Then, just making sure that there's no excess water down in the bottom. Get that out of there. Alright, so that's two different ways of sort of doing some decorative things on the outside of the pot while you are in the process of throwing it. A lot of the other decorative things that happen when the pots have dried out a little bit. Like, for example, I sometimes do a technique called chattering on the outside of the pots, which I will be exhibiting a little bit later on. But these are ways to texture the clay while you're throwing it. And I'm going to do another version in just a moment here. So let's see, I've got that. Make sure that's cut off again, which it is. This time I am going to stop it. I'm going to use my fingers as a couple of forks here and try and lift it up. And in order to lift it up, I'm going to turn the wheel with my foot down here without having to sort of twist. Okay. And I'm going to do a different shape than I did before. And I'm going to show you another texturing thing that a number of people use, and it's another it's a very interesting way of doing this, throwing pots here. So again, I get the clay as centered as I can on here. I lean into it. I'm pushing forward with my right hand and then pushing against with my left hand. I'm lifting it up, and again I'm exerting a lot of muscle contraction all the way. It's in my arms, and it's especially here in my pectorals up here as well. And that's the kind of thing that you really need to do. If you can't center the clay, you're not going to have a particularly good pot, shall we say. It does take a while to learn how to do this, but once you do, it's relatively easy. So again, up and down a couple of times here, just to make sure that everything is all aligned, and any air bubbles that might be in there are getting pressed into the center where they can be popped out when you open it up. Alright. Get that out of the way. So this time I'm going to do sort of a tall vase shape, more or less. I'll start by pushing in with my thumb. You'll notice that I'm putting my weight on top of here. I definitely have some arthritis that has started to grow in there, which kind of sucks, but there's not much you can do about it. So just trying to save what I have left of my thumb there. And then I'm going to push down in the center here. One way that is very good to determine how thick that the clay is down there on the bottom is you take a pin tool, which I have right here, out of sight. You certainly get to know or have a sense over time, like over my past 49 years of being a potter, I have a sense of how deep this is, but I'm going to use this just as a way to determine how much clay is down there at the bottom. I'm just going to poke it down until it hits the top of the wheel, put my finger against it, and then pull it out. And I see that I've got probably about 3/8 of an inch of clay left there in the bottom. That's a little bit more than I want it to be, so I know that I need to go down just a little bit deeper in there. And of course, pressing on it, sort of pushes the clay back into, sealing up that little pinhole that you put in there. Alright, so the next thing is going to be, again, I'm pushing, putting the heel of my hand here. I'm putting my elbow against here so that I have a good solid base to push against, and then I'm going to start pulling the clay out without letting my outer hand move. I'm trying to make that as stationary as possible so that the pushing makes it thin out and start to pull itself up. Alright, I can feel something down in there, like a little chunk of something, but it'll probably pop itself out. Alright, so again, now I'm going to push my fingers on the inside against my palm of my hand, so I don't want the top to start expanding out. It's just not a good idea. Alright, so that's first pulling. Notice that I'm keeping, a lot of times when potters are first learning, they think that, you know, they'll start to pull the clay up and it gets harder and harder, and they want the top to look nice and thin. So what they do is the bottom could be that thick across the bottom, but then they pull it up until it's almost a knife edge at the top. That's not good. You know, you've got to have enough clay at the very top there to, you know, have enough clay to, you know, expand it or to reshape it or something like that. So you don't have to do everything in one pull or even two pulls. Just take as many as you need. Okay, now I can see that I do have a chunk of something in the clay. I've recycled some of my clay, and some of it might have just, yeah, this is a nice chunk. I actually did some work on my potter's wheel, so there's a piece of rusted metal right there. I don't really want to have that in the pot, so I'm glad that I caught that when I did. I've had this wheel for, boy, it must be 45 years by now or something. It's been a great wheel for me. It's called a Lockerbie electrified kick wheel. One of the best wheels in the world as far as I'm concerned. Anyway, I'm going to start pulling up again. And remember that I am always backing my hands away very slowly, so that instead of having it, you know, if you pull it away suddenly and it's going to be all wobbly, just slowly removing your hands is the key to keeping it in center. Again, I'm going to compress that apart here. Got a good thick rim right now, which is exactly what I want to hold on to, because that's going to help keep it nice and round. So let's do another pull here. Usually 2 to 3 pulls are all that's needed. Notice how my hands are very close to my chest. Like this. Okay, that looks kind of weird, but that's what you do, and then you sort of pull your whole body up like that. And that way you have much more control over keeping the pot from getting all wobbly. And it does work quite well. Alright. Now, because this is still kind of narrow and it's harder for me to get my hand down inside of there, I can see that I've got kind of a little pool of water down there, and I don't want that to sit in there. It's okay for it to be in there for a little while, but you don't want to let it sit in there so that the clay starts to absorb that extra water. So then you use one of these devices. I've probably had this for 45 years as well. I've probably changed the sponge on the end of it about 50 times, I would say. So what it is, it's just putting a sponge on the end of a long stem here so that you can reach down inside where you couldn't necessarily get your hand in as easily. Mop up that excess water, squeeze it out. There it is. All right. moment. Alright, so next I'll take the rib here. And I'm going to start at the top and I'm going to work down and removing some of the excess water and sort of slip on the outside of this shape here. It's making the pot a little bit thinner in the walls, but it still is going to strengthen the pot. See, that's a fair amount of clay right there that I just removed, but that is for the better. Okay, now I'm going to be try to get that last little bit of water out of there. I'm now going to use something that is has a very interesting, some very interesting texturing things. I use some material called sodium silicate, which is a liquid thing. You can buy like a pint of it for a couple of bucks or whatever. And it does an interesting thing to the clay. One of the things that holds clay together is this sort of electromagnetic adhesion between the platelets of clay. Clay is basically very, very flat, pieces of on a molecular level. They're very, very flat, and once they're together like this, they have a strong electromagnetic attraction to one another. So when you move things around, it sort of holds the clay together. Now you can shape the clay and so on and so forth as I'm doing, but using the sodium silicate, actually I've already got some of this out. Sodium silicate has the effect of actually stopping or ending that electromagnetic force. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start at the top here, and I'm going to paint some of this sodium silicate down the side of the pot here. I've got to dip it into the stuff a little bit more. The reason I put it into this little cup here is that I don't want to dip it into the, if you keep on using this on clay, then sometimes the redness, or some of the clay itself, begins to discolor it. So I want to keep the stuff in the bottle nice and clean and just pour out what I feel that I need. Alright, so there's a pretty good layer. You probably can't see it too well from where you are because of the lighting and the filming that's going on here, but take my word for it that it is at a certain point. So get rid of a little bit of the extra clay. One of the things that can happen is that if the clay, or if the sodium silicate drops down, or drips down the side of it, which it tends to do, then you don't want to use that same clay. So that first piece that I just pulled off there was still safe. This has got some sodium silicate to it, so this is essentially something that I'm just simply going to throw away. I'm going to put it over there for now. But the sodium silicate is doing its magic, so to speak. Okay, now you don't see much of anything that's going on right now because I haven't started to sort of stretch this out a little bit. But what you're going to see is the more that I stretch it, the more it's going to look as though it's splitting, more or less. It's it's like an oak tree or something like that that is just growing so big, and it creates these cracks and crags and everything in it. So the best way to do this is to use a rib on the inside. I'm going to use a wooden rib that I have here that's got the right sort of curvature to it. And the other thing that I'm going to use that really helps to cause the splitting effect. Now it only happens on the very surface. It doesn't penetrate all the way through. But what I'm going to do is I have a heat gun here, and I use the heat gun a lot anyway, and there's a number of reasons why, but for now I'm just going to use this to sort of dry out the outside walls of this a little bit. The sodium silicate is probably already penetrated down into the clay, maybe 1/8 of an inch or so. But by trying to dry it out a little bit more, it will actually make the cracks be even deeper and larger, which is what I want to do. It's just so you can get an illustration of it. I'm going to dry out the inside a little bit as well. Some people think that using a hair dryer will work as well, and the answer is no, it doesn't. A hair dryer gives you some heat and a lot of air so that your hair doesn't catch on fire. A paint stripper like this, heat gun, puts out just a little bit of air but a lot of heat, and it's used basically to melt paint or soften paint so that you can scrape it off the walls of your your house or something like that. But what this does is it really dries out the clay quite a lot. So you got to be careful. You can get burned by it very easily. So let me again. I just want to turn out this rim up here where the sodium silicate has not penetrated. Just going to turn that out like that. Helps to keep it round. Feel one other chunky thing up here I'm going to try and get rid of. This doesn't feel like metal like the early piece did. It's just something else. Right, so now I'm going to take this dry rib, wet the top a little bit here, and I'm going to start expanding from the inside. Very dry on the inside. It's kind of wet with the sodium silicate on the outside, but I can definitely feel the cracking happening on the outside. So I'm going to start at the top again and go down. Alright, now I'm going to let this stop so you can see what has started to happen. It started to fracture all around here, but there's still clay on the inside that still is holding it together, so you're not getting cracks that go all the way through. That would be kind of counterintuitive to do that. But what I'm going to do now is, because I want to expand the top a little bit more, but I don't want to get it spread out too much. What I'm going to do is I'm going to dry out the inside of the vase here as I'm pulling it up. So I'm trying to heat up the top part of it and stiffen up the bottom part as well. I want to keep the bottom shape about the same, but just stretch the top out a little bit more. And I can definitely feel the hot air coming out of the vase. What this is doing too is, because the outside or the inside is getting heated up, the water that is still in the clay is sort of pushed to the outside more or less, which is good. Alright, so again I'm going to go back in with that rib, start at the top, push it out. Just have to sort of like watch the outside of the vase to see what the shape is going to be like, and just be very, very gentle. It takes a steady hand to do this, so just take your time, let it happen. Alright, I'm beginning to like that shape pretty much here. Alright, so I'm done shaping the outside of the piece here, but now I'm going to do the last part, which is to change shape of the top part. It's kind of a little dry on there. And because I'm going to be thinning the clay a little bit more, I've got to add just enough water for it to be able to sort of slip through my fingers here. Now the thing about doing this changing here is I'm being very, very delicate. There are sort of 3 stages of working with clay. And I have some tools or suggestions that I sometimes use about how to handle clay. Sometimes you need to use almost like a bulldozer approach to clay. And that's when you're either when you're wedging the clay to get it homogenized, and when you're throwing the clay and getting it centered. That's where it takes a lot of just brute strength to kind of like push on it, lift it up, push it back down a couple of times to get it done. Then, after you've used the bulldozer, then you switch over to sort of using what I would call the sand shovel, basically. And that's where you are still manipulating the shapes and everything, but you're not using as much brute force. You're kind of, you're still pulling the clay up a little bit and you're starting to shape it and everything. But then at the final end you come down to what I call the baby spoon kind of touch to it. So I am still changing the shapes here, but I'm doing it very, very, very delicately, because if you put too much brute force in this now, then the whole thing can sort of collapse underneath you. So it's a very, very, very light touch. Now, I had that turned out before, which helped sort of keep it from getting all wobbly at the top, but now I've decided that I'm going to change this and have it sort of fold in instead. So I'm just going to gently and slowly bring it inwards like that. Like I say, this is just like the baby teaspoon part of it. Notice that I'm going downwards here to sort of change the shape of it. Push that out just a little bit there, and the sodium silicated area. Alright, so I kind of like that shape there. Now I'm going to smooth it out a little bit more. Smooth out the top. It's a little bit rough, kind of some sharp edges, but this is where the chamois comes in quite well. It rounds it, it compresses it, pushes any grog. Grog is sort of like sand, and there's grog in clay sometimes to open it up so that when it dries out it doesn't have the it doesn't crack as it sometimes would otherwise. And let's see. So I'm just going to use one of these edges here. I'm going to create a distinct line between the sodium silicate area that's fractured and the part that isn't. It's nice and smooth. It's that change in texture that really sort of makes the pot sort of pop more or less. Sort somewhat like it does with photography. Alright, so put it down here on the bottom, take a look at it, and it's looking pretty darn good, I would say. See, there's a little bit of extra water there in the bottom. It looks pretty good. So now here's a time when I'm changing, instead of using that straight line here, now I'm going to use this curve right here because I want to sort of compress the bottom a little bit more, but I don't want to be cutting it with a straight line. I want to still maintain some curvature in there. So I'm just going to start at the bottom, push in and compress it. I'm not really cutting too much away as much as I am just compressing the walls. So there's a little bit of clay on the bottom there. So later, when this piece is cut off, I can still trim away some clay down there at the bottom, and in fact really cut it way down so it's almost on its own tiny little pedestal before it completely flares out and then comes back in on the top. But sometimes gives it sort of a more dynamic appearance or whatever. So again, here, this is another way to do texturing while you are throwing the pot to begin with. So next little vignette here is going to be just throwing a nice shape and putting it aside, and the texturing is going to go into it when it has dried out after being in the leather hard stage for a day or so. So I'm going to take a break now. Here we go. In this portion of this video here, I'm going to do a couple of things with one piece of clay. First thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to throw a small bowl just to sort of show how I shape some of these things. I'm going to do a little bit of texturing around the edges of the bowl, but then I'm going to take the remaining clay and I'm going to kind of collapse it on here so that it's more or less a disc on top of the wheel head here. And the reason for that is that the next few pots that I'm going to be making after that are going to be made on some bats, and bats are just basically discs that you put on top of there, and that slab of clay holds it on top of the wheel so that it doesn't move all the way around. So you'll see what I'm talking about when I start working here. So first thing to do, put that on the wheel. I'm going to be throwing some larger pieces on some of those bats as well, but I'm going to do a small bowl here to begin with. Usually any time that I make pots that are relatively small, like coffee mugs, ikebana planters, earring bowls, cereal bowls, things like that, I usually start off with a very large lump of clay here, and I only raise up what I need at that time to throw that piece. And it's much easier because you're first of all not working right against the that wheel head right here. When you have a large piece of clay up here, it's much more easy to just bring up what you need, you know, center it, open it up, shape it, and then cut it off, put it on the board, and then just go back and do another one. So sometimes you can throw as many as like 15 mugs out of one lump of clay, or a dozen small bowls or something like that. So it's just a technique that a lot of potters use. So I basically centered this, come up and down a couple of times. We're going to go down one more time just to sort of make sure here, and pull up what I feel is good for like a cereal bowl sort of a shape or so. So I've got that all centered and everything. Again, I'm going to just put an indentation at the top here to begin with to get it started. And got some water in there, so I'm going to push down with my fingers what I think feels about the right size. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to start pulling up and outwards. Now this is a case, because this is going to be a bowl, this is a case where I don't mind having the bowl or the clay flare out as I'm pulling it out here. Usually doesn't take more than like about 2 or 3 pulls to get the general thickness of the clay established, more or less. So I'm going to go up again, line it upwards and outwards. And again, every time I am done pulling, I let it turn a couple of times in my fingers here before I let go of it very, very gently. Now the other thing is too, I want to have a good rim out there at the edge of it, because that's the most vulnerable part in terms of potentially breaking it. So you don't want to have it really be thin or anything like that. You want to have almost like sort of a slight bulge in the thickness of the rim. So let's do one more pull. That sort of establishes the overall size. And I'm going to kind of, change the shape here a little bit. That was just basically to bring it out to the right dimensions and all, right thickness, and to compress the rim a little bit here. Better to do it now before I do the shaping, because sometimes the shaping can actually be hard to push against. So I want to have that rim be nice and established before I shape it. So now I'm going to wet down just a little bit on the inside, because I'm going to be using my fingers on the inside here, but I'm going to be using the rib here once again to kind of clean up the clay a little bit. So starting at the top, I'm going to push down and out against the against the rib here, more or less. Now I also want to cut down a little bit underneath it so that I have enough clay in the bottom. I want it to be thicker than I would normally throw it, because what I want to do is when the bowl has dried out a little bit, I want to have a foot on it. And a foot just basically means it's sort of like a little, it's going to be a round circular thing that's going to be cut on the inside, upside down. And it kind of raises the bowl up right off the the table that it's going to be sitting on. It sort of acts like a pedestal, more or less. And it also, because you're cutting away some of the clay on the inside, that tends to lighten it up a little bit. So basically, I have just smoothed the outside edge here. And now I'm going to use this wonderful curved rib right here. This is sort of a stiff stainless steel rib. Clean off some of the drier clay off of there. Just sort of cut it off a bit. The thing that I like about this rib in particular is the different shapes and curves that there are to it. In some cases you want to have sort of a very gentle curve like this, and in other cases you want to have a much more abrupt and sharper curve, so to speak, or a really sharp, twist around things like this. And this has all of those different shapes in there, all in one piece, and depending upon how you hold it, you can use it for different reasons. You can turn it around and push it out from the inside using this side right here. It's just a really wonderful tool here. It's very well made, very high quality steel. So, having already smoothed out the outside, now I'm going to begin to impress on the inside of the bowl. And again, I'm starting at the top and I'm working my way down. Now sometimes I go back up again, expand it out a bit more, and then go back down. And there's such a nice curve to this rib here, and all you have to do is pretty much just press it down to have just the perfect bowl shape on the inside. So, again, like I've taken away quite a bit of clay here, but that's alright. I kind of want to do that. I can always recycle that clay, and in fact that's what I usually do, is just take the excess clay and just run it through the Pug Mill again, and it's fine to use again. Alright, so I'm going to put kind of a wide rim on here for a couple of reasons. One is that I want to show a couple of other sort of texturing ideas that you can use. Also to change the shape a little bit. So I'm going to use the flat edge of the rim here, and I'm just going to flatten that out there. I've got my finger underneath it just to sort of hold it good and stable. And I'm going to go back in again with a curve here, and sort of deepen the bowl a little bit. Obviously the rim is pretty wide here, so you can't really get food up there on top. So you need to have a deep enough bowl to hold, for example, if it's soup or cereal or something like that. Alright, so I've got that done pretty well. And you remember that, if there's any tiny little flaws in there of one sort or another, they're certainly probably going to be covered over by the glaze that you're using. If there are really deep gaps or something like that, then it will show up. But by and large, it's pretty safe to assume that the glaze is going to fill in any tiny little things that are happening. So here's another texturing thing, a couple of things that you can do. I don't normally do both of these, but I'm going to take a homemade thing. Some of you who have hair on your head might recognize that this is just a chopped off piece of a heavy comb sort of a thing. It was much longer than that. I've got different sizes of it too. Some of them are a bit longer. Basically I just took it off of the handle that was used for brushing your hair and cut it into smaller pieces here, and then I put it on a bolt here so that it can spin around like this, and it spins pretty freely. So what you can do with these things now is, first of all I'm going to dry this out just a little bit. If it's wet, I don't want it sort of sticking to the pointy parts there. Okay. Then, I'm just going to very carefully hold this, make sure that it will spin freely. And I'm going to slow it down a bit, and I'm going to take my sponge, get a little bit of water underneath it, because if I'm pushing this down, just the pushing thing is going to make that rim kind of push down. You don't want to do that. You've got to have something underneath it. And really the only way to do that when the clay is still soft is to have a sponge underneath it so that you can push it up. So I'm just going to hold it in there, let it turn, and there we go. Now, that's not a really deep impression in there by any means, but you can see that by just holding that underneath there, I was able to put some impressions right around the edge here. So now I'm going to kind of smooth out those edges a little bit. Okay. Right, now remember that I'm just sort of demonstrating different ways of putting texture into the clay. Now, I've got a couple of different things. They are somewhat similar. They're basically, I think, like kitchen tools, and you can use these for, putting designs around the edges of pies before you put it in the oven and so on and so forth. They're pretty similar. This one is more of deep loops going back and forth like that. This one is more sort of zigzag kind of a shape in here. But I'm going to, again, get the wet sponge behind here, and I'm just going to very carefully and slowly so that has left sort of a, I don't know if you can see it in the photo here, but there's definitely a zigzag pattern to it. And then, just as another example, I'm going to use this other one, which is a little bit deeper, and I'm going to hold it a little bit lower. There we go, and that makes a similar but more of a wavy kind of indentation here around the edge. Now the problem is that if it's not very deep, you have to be very, very subtle. You have to, you know, it can be, you know, the glaze can sometimes fill it in if the glaze is really, really thick. So sometimes you might want to do these impressions and leave these parts of something to be unglazed. That's a kind of a good way to, you know, to sort of show off the subtlety of it and so on and so forth. So again, these are just a couple of different tools that I just have acquired over the years. They're usually pretty cheap. You never know when you're going to find something that you can use when you're making pots. So. And then, now let's go back over here to this tool that I've used before, first time around. It's probably got more different decorations in the piece itself than it would normally have, but again, I'm just sort of demonstrating these things. So I'm going to use this tool, this sort of chevron kind of, I love the fact that it has a curve as it's coming out like that, right on the very tip here. From a sharp point, it kind of fans out instead of just being a straight, you know, triangular kind of a line. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to have this spinning around, and I'm going to start in the middle, and I'm just going to kind of swirl it out to have a nice swirl in the middle that will just increase. And I'll just do this. You can't really see what I'm doing, but maybe when I take it off I can move the camera down here. So start right in the middle and swirl it right out. Alright, so I've done that. Now, make sure that the bottom here is clean and dry. Cut this off. Again, I'm letting it cut into the clay a little bit, and then I'm sort of quickly pulling it through on the other side so that it's a nice, smooth, even cut. And then, because it's relatively dry, I can pick it up with my fingers here, and I can tilt it just a little bit so that you can see that swirl right there in the middle of it. So that was relatively easy to do. And again, there's 3 or 4 different texturings that I put in here with different tools, but you know, they can all sort of contribute to the appearance of the piece in the long run. So, all right. Now, as I say, the next thing that I'm going to do, the next few pots that I'm going to make are going to be pieces that I really should be throwing on a bat. Now again, we call it a bat, and those of you who are cavers are kind of going, what are you doing with bats on your wheel here? That doesn't make much sense. It's a different definition for what a bat is when it comes to pottery. Just get all of that excess water off of there. So, the bat that I am going to be using, a couple of bats. I have one of them here. These are what I am referring to as being bats. And what they are, these are were custom made for me. These are basically about, I don't know, 1/4 inch thick masonite, and it was cut out using a special kind of laser-based cutting device here. And so what I am going to do is, rather than throwing a large piece on here, then I would have to wait until it dries out before I could cut it off and pick it up without distorting the shape of it. So using a bat like this is a way to actually throw something on the wheel, and it's going to be attached by this disc of clay that I'm going to put on here. And you can see that this one has already been used. There's some leftover dry clay on there, but for now I'm just going to leave that as it is. So some wheels have they have pins that sort of stick up out of the edges of the of the wheel here. And what happens is that you can buy pre-drilled holes in there, so that instead of using this disc of clay that I use, you can just plop it on there like that. Well, they sort of work for a little while, but after a while, after they've been used a lot, the holes in the masonite tend to get worn out, so you can kind of feel the thing kind of moving a little bit depending upon when you're pushing on it, and I find that to be very annoying. And also, I don't want to have those pins sticking up while I'm throwing pots, because they could easily take a chunk of skin right out of the edge of your hand if you're not being really careful. So anyway, what I'm going to do now is I've already sort of centered this and all that, and so I'm just going to start pressing down on this, and it's going to expand out underneath the heel of my hand here, or the edge of my hand. I want to make sure that it's going to be really good and smooth all the way around. This is not a whole lot of clay on here, but for the few pots that I'm going to be making this way, this will probably do just fine.